March 5th, 2025. Roll call, please.
Arel, Budke,
Here.
Kleva,
Here.
Kuhn, Holt,
Here.
Mattson,
Here.
Reichert,
Here.
Sandy. Here. Wasvik.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Perfect. Reading of an approval of the minutes from our February 5th meeting, 2025. Mr. Reichert?
Move approval.
Whoever wants it. Thanks, Mr. Cleva. Okay, any further discussion on the minutes? Not seeing any. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, same sign. All right, minutes are approved as presented. Public hearings, final approvals, petitions, and minor changes. 3-1.
3-1, plat of Carenta Lem 7-3 subdivision located at 1910 North 52nd Street with street and highway ordinance dedication.
Ms.
Hello.
Grasser.
So this is the final time you'll see this plat come through. This is to make way for a larger pond for this development. And this line here will be the rededication of the easement, just moving it to the east a little bit. Yeah, again, it's just to make lot 1 larger for their pond. The ordinance is also attached. And I'll stand for any questions.
Any questions for Ms. Grasser? We do have a public hearing. I will open up the public hearing. Anybody in the audience want to address 3-1, please do so at this time. Seeing no one, I'll bring it back to the commission. Mr. Reichert.
Move approval.
Moved by Mr. Reichert,
Second.
second by Mr. Mattson. Any further discussion? Seeing no hands, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. 3-1 carries. 3-2.
3-2, ordinance to amend zoning map, rezoning from B3 to R4, Lot A, Block 51, Alexander and Ives Edition, located at 1027 North 5th Street.
Hi there. Again, we're up on North Fifth Street. This would be the final approval for this rezoning request. You saw it preliminary last month. They're requesting, it's an existing single-family house on the property. They're requesting to rezone it to R4, which would fit the rest of the near north neighborhood in order to allow for a sale and financing to occur. So staff's recommending approval.
All right, any questions for Mrs. Edwardson before we move to the public hearing? Not seeing one. Anybody in the audience would step up to the microphone, address 3-2, please do so at this time. Seeing no one, bring it back to the commission. Mr. Reichert.
Move approval.
Moved by Mr. Reichert, second by Mr. Budke. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. 3-2 passes. Communications and preliminary approvals. 4-1.
4-1, ordinance to amend City of Grand Forks, Chapter 18, Land Development Code, Section 18-0101, relating to membership of the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Chair Wasvik. So this particular ordinance kind of came out of a bill that was at the North Dakota State Legislature, which is looking at trying to get the military bases, making sure they're covered and they buy any developments that are going on within City of Grand Forks ET area and within the city itself. I think there's I'll say a companion type request similar to this one that may be making its way as well through the Grand Forks County Planning Commission as well. And the way we've drafted this is, as of right now, we're requesting, and it was approved by the City Council on Monday to make this request of the Planning Commission that'll go back to the City Council itself to put a either the wing commander or his or her designee as a ex officio on this commission. So from the perspective, it would be similar to city engineer spot is the way we have that drafted right now. So they would provide info when it was relevant. It may not always have, if it was a simple replat, I don't know if they would have anything. But if it's something maybe related to a conditional use for a telecommunications tower, they probably are going to ask some questions, making sure that their interests are heated as well. So that's really where this request is at. This would be preliminary approval tonight, And presuming it moves forward, it'd be back to you next month for final. So text amendments take 2 months. So that's the kind of the time frame. So I'm happy to stand for any questions that you may have.
I would like to see a discussion on this one. I think it's just trying to figure it all out. Mr. Reichert?
Has the Air Force requested this, or have they been informed about it? Or, I mean, did it come from them, and do we know if they want to be on it?
I have not asked that question yet, but I will be doing that before final.
Okay.
Making sure that the wing commander is aware of it, which it very possibly is. I just don't have that info. We had a very short time frame. We had Monday, city council taking final action. I know that the state of the air base was this morning. I suspect that they have been made, that they are aware of it, but I don't have that information. I personally did not have a conversation with them on it.
What's the impetus for it? For this?
I think it came out of, like I said, there was a state legislative bill that was going on, and I believe it came out of that. And I think in relatively recent times, right, there's been lots of requests making sure that our air bases are protected, and I think it came out of, I suspect that legislation came out of that. I have not gone back to see what our local legislator who drafted that bill, what all of his reasons were, but I believe it was about protecting the Air Force Base, and it's not just the Grand Forks Air Force Base. The original legislation had Minot Air Force Base, Cavalier Air Station, and I believe Camp Grafton South on there as well. There was 4 installations total.
So are all these planning commissions having to do the same thing?
I don't know what their reactions are going to be. The bill.
I just think, Mr. Brook, I think we're putting the cart in front of the horse a little bit. There's just, like you said, we don't know a lot of information. All of a sudden it ends up on a bill and then ends up on the radio and everywhere else, and we go, oh, here we are.
I could say a couple things if you would allow. I don't remember what the bill was, the number of the bill, and I don't have all of the specifics, but I do know that the bill was an effort to put together a committee who would then be, I don't know if I would say in charge or responsible, would be tasked with any development that happens within a certain mile radius of an Air Force base, which would have impeded even on the city of Grand Forks for them to be able to come in and have some control over how our city grows and develops. And so it was not passed by I think it was at the House, it was not passed by the House. And so this is more than anything a courtesy, so that rather than having something that seems quite intrusive to our city and to our planning and zoning and our city council, this is a way for us to be sure that the Air Force Base doesn't miss out on any of the developments that are coming up and has a voice to raise concerns. And I do know that this was something that is welcomed by our governor as a way to just kind of increase awareness for our base. So I believe that's where this is coming from.
And I don't necessarily have a problem with any of it. It just, we just don't know a lot of the information of what we want to do. And we're even asking you, Mr. Brooks, of what, does the base aware of it? We don't know. Is this aware of it? We don't know. It just passed through legislation. It just, I'm fine if we just had a little more.
Yeah, I do know the commander of the Grand Forks Air Force Base. It was the Senate Bill 2398. He did provide testimony, so I know he was aware of that bill. That version has been amended down. Originally, it was, I think, to Ms. Sandy's point, it was originally 25 miles around the Grand Forks Air Force Base. That would completely encompass Grand Forks. And it was stated that everything, essentially, the way I read that bill is everything would be going before them that was within that 25-mile radius. It was amended. The new version was a little bit softer in terms of the way it sits now is that every Air Force base kind of evaluates to see what their area is, because Grand Forks Air Force Base, is 25 miles the right number? Well, I don't know what that number will end up being, but I don't think we would be in it.
No.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just want to say that the actual way that it's amended is that it can increase that area or decrease it, but it's completely up to the commission that is formed to do that. It would not be something that the city of Grand Forks would have a say in how large that area is. So I think even some of the simplest developments, somebody on this commission, the way I understand it, could stop a development in our city.
Yeah,
That's my understanding.
it was I understood the intent of the original bill, but yeah, there were some things that, there was a concern about what the long-term effect could be on the city of Grand Forks. And, even if they were in agreement with something, it was certainly going to, I think at the very best, you would be delaying projects, even if everything had passed. And so there was definite concern, even if things went along and yeah, they passed it, you would end up with a delay, because a lot of times, by the time we get things, we have, they're looking to get into the ground, or, because either.
We got a short construction season.
Yeah, they get it very short. So there is a lot of concern, even if things would have moved along, it's adding another layer, which is always, or can be concerning. And it's not that, I don't think any of us wanted to, we're not looking to have a negative impact on the Air Force Base, but there was
Yeah, no.
potential concern of what that could mean for development, even if, checking some boxes take a little bit longer and can affect development.
When I was on the school board, we had a member from the Air Base School Board who would sit on our city school board, and then we would also rotate through the city school board members sitting on at their school board meetings. We weren't voting, but it's kind of to create a sense of community with the city of Grand Forks and the Air Force Base. And so I think that this is a positive thing, and I see no drawbacks to this. It's just going to create a better relationship so that everyone's on the same page and knows what's coming up and no one's surprised.
Well, in today's world, you can watch this thing online, you can read all the minutes, you can there's easy ways of keeping in touch.
Well, I understand that too, but so when you're here, Steve, you always know because you're sitting at the table. Right? And you kind of know what's happening firsthand. So I think some of the point
Sometimes.
is, well, as much as anyone's going to, but more so than somebody who tunes into a meeting or doesn't have the opportunity for the dialogue that, for example, we're having right now. And I think that is part of what makes that.
And I was hoping, Miss Sandy, to see somebody here that, maybe a potential candidate or something or whatever, if this is important enough, then, maybe come at final and say, hey, this is what I'm instructed to do or whatever. And it's kind of like, we all went through interviews to get on this thing and through that process. So it'd be nice to see, I know we're just setting up a position right now, but it'd be nice to see what that would look like, or even the person that's in charge of the position to set up would come and say, this is my intentions with the committee or whatever. That's,
Yeah,
I'm not
no, I
against it,
understand that.
I just want to understand the reasoning and, of course,
There's so much movement at the base too that,
I know.
It'll be up to the base commander who it is, but I'm guessing that face will change often as it did on the school board, even the members of their own school board, because they may or may not be able to fulfill that role for very long. And so it wouldn't be something that we're involved in an interview, because again, they won't be able to vote on the matters.
Sure. Anybody else got anything? Mr. Laker?
Yeah, I guess I was a little confused. So this commission what is this commission going to do? I mean, are they going to be recommending stuff, or does?
With the state the
Yeah.
legislative bill?
Yeah.
So it is set up right now to have a, potentially, and of course, we're on our second version of that bill, but it would be a commission, military compatibility commission, I think. I'm probably not phrasing that correctly, but they would have reps from township rep, a county rep, that would, and then an Air Force Base rep that would evaluate what the distance around that military base is, depending on the mission, and then they would be the ones that would potentially be looking at developments within that range on whether or not they had a negative effect on that mission of the Air Force Base.
So would that commission then be able to veto what we do, or would they be
I
able to?
still saw it as, I don't know if it had full veto power, or if it was, they would make a recommendation.
Okay.
So I didn't read that version. I don't know where it'll finally end up because that won't be known until that bill goes final, but I suspect it still may have some different amendments to it before it's done.
And that bill is passed the House, or
It's
it's,
passed the Senate and has moved on to the House.
Okay.
With an amended version from its original.
Mr. Riker.
Yeah, I'm going to move approval, and I'm just going to say that, well, I'll have my comments later, but I mean, we need more information before I'd vote on final. And I think we might want to wait until the legislation passes to see what the legislation is. But just to keep it moving, since it's a two-meeting deal, I'll move approval.
Okay.
Moved by Mr. Rickert,
Second.
second by Ms. Sandy. Any further discussion? I know you guys, Mr. Budke, please.
So just to clarify, right, because we've been talking, I think, about two different things, right? There's legislation in the Capitol about creating perhaps like a 25-mile district.
is it?
Yeah, something like that. That's under consideration. What's in front of us is just the composition of this body adding a non-voting member.
Correct.
Okay.
But it depends on the wording of how that comes through the Senate or House, if it gets changed, or like Mr. Riker, that's what my point was.
Sure.
The cart's a little bit before the horse. Mr. Mattson? You had something?
to your point too, about being appointed, does the language need to include anything regarding who's going to appoint him, if the mayor has any involvement, if it's strictly up to the Air Force Base who this person would be? Do we need to define that up front? Or
We have
not?
no information.
Yeah.
I think some of that needs to come back before we vote final, so.
Yeah, I will say, the way it's drafted now is I do have it as the commander of the Grand Forks Air Force Base, or I had written, or his designee. It was pointed out that it should be, or their designee, because we don't know. It should be more neutral on that, so thank you for that comment, Commissioner Budke, who had pointed that out to me. So, but just so you're aware, that's kind of where it's at. They would make that determination, and it would be up to the commander to either sit themselves on the, as an ex officio, or send a designee.
Okay, any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Right?
Opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Miss Edwardson, take us home.
Sounds good. I might be up here for a little bit, but you'll bear with me. We've had 3 site plans under review, or 4, excuse me, with the monthly update. I guess Winship's been approved. In addition to this monthly update, the Grand Valley pedestrian study that the MPO conducted a couple presentations last year. City Council received and filed it, so just wanted to make you aware that that one's a completed study and done. We'll just move on from that one. I'm assuming there's no questions. As a legislative update, that 2398 military impact does have a committee hearing tomorrow at 10:30. We'll see what may come out of that with the House, I believe. HB 1500 is the non-conforming bill that has crossed over, which would, we'll discuss a little bit more in the non-conforming section, but of tonight's meeting, but it's in an effort to make it easier to finance residential properties, whether they're in a conforming zone or not. The 2254 is the transit funding bill. That one crossed over and is still moving along. 2225 is the housing fund infrastructure home one. That one's continued to cross over too. I didn't see a committee hearing there, but so relatively little zoning bills, so to speak, plenty of city-related things. John Bernstrom with Public Information has a list of those on the city's legislative page, but thankfully, little planning stuff, other than that military impact one being a huge impact depending on, no pun intended, where it falls, and how that goes about. The non-conforming one, as a city perspective, we're gonna get into the updates we're gonna do with the non-conforming code to kind of align with it. So we're not really tracking it in terms of an opposition or anything like that as far as legislative goes, because the intent is to help residential, and we hear it and we understand there's a need for it, and the things we're gonna talk about with non-conforming, we're trying to align with it. So whether it passes or not, it's a good intent that we think we should take on locally. So, any questions with that? Or I can get into non-conforming. Okay,
Not seeing any hands.
this one will take a little bit to get through. I'll feel a little bit like the MPO, but you guys will be okay. So non-conformities, I probably shouldn't say that, the MPO does great work. Just going high level with the planning philosophy, right? The community development, or community sets a vision in their land use plan in terms of where we want to grow, where we want future land uses, where we want our growth tiers, how much growth we expect to see in the next 25 years, where we think it should be, what it should look like. That's our community vision and our guiding document. You've seen that on our staff reports, how we are complying and consistency with that. Going down to the next level is the zoning district, which is the execution of the land use plan. So that's where if the land use plan, we want industrial here, we set the zoning district there. Following level would be within those zoning districts is where you get your defined, very distinct and specified allowable uses, what's allowed here, what's not allowed there. So that's the hierarchy and how things go. But because the community obviously evolves and things change and markets change and dynamics change, zoning districts change over time with the community. And so nonconformities comes into play when legally built under the old laws, not complying under the new laws. That's how we get our nonconformings. So what it is and what sometimes people refer to them as like legal nonconformings. It's a way to soften that non-conforming verbiage. They are legal by their definition. They were built legally, rules changed on them. Now we want to transition them out. Illegal built are just that. They weren't permitted, they didn't receive any construction permits, they weren't reviewed, or they started operating in their uses in allowed period and we just haven't caught them yet or something like that. So that's the difference. But you might hear legal nonconforming. There's no such thing as a legal nonconforming. There's just an illegal build or an illegal operation. So it can be a little confusing. That nonconforming term can scare some folks, but really we're recognizing you played by the rules before. We changed the rules on you. Is kind of what it boils down to. So why we do that, again, we want to minimize that use that we don't want to see in that district anymore. And so we do that by guarding against the expansion of the nonconformity. We don't allow additions, we don't allow the use to take up more of the lot than it already does. And we do this in a way in hopes of recognizing that that property owner still has purchased and invested and has value in that property. So city as a whole wants to see that use transition, still want to recognize that the property owner has an asset there. So the different types, and yes, I took these slides from the North Dakota Planning Association. Non-conforming, you have three different types of non-conformings. A land use, which is simply the use isn't allowed anymore in that district or the district changed. In this example, we have residential homes in what's now zoned light industrial. Residential is now considered non-conforming to that zoning district. Different type would be a non-conforming lot, which is essentially too small of a lot. Minimum lot sizes may have increased after they were established. Again, mostly in our older neighborhoods where they were established prior to zoning even being in place. In this instance, you have like the back half of some lot where now the minimum lot size is twice the size. Which we've run into and had some hiccups with some of our existing small lots, which we'll get to and try to fix up. The one that's missing here that I apparently didn't save is the non-conforming structure, which is essentially the use is permitted, but the structure, the zoning design elements, your property setbacks, your front yard setback from the road, your side yard setbacks from your neighbors, your rear yard setbacks, they might not be conforming in that. Your impervious surface potentially too, right? So the use is allowed, but the building isn't quite situated what the current standards would say we'd want to see. So those are the three different types. Our current code was written in the 80s. The last full land development code update we did was in 87, which also went with some new, I think, I don't know, I wasn't around, and oddly enough, neither was he. How things happened, right, and evolved, if it was new zoning districts or if the zoning districts in place changed a lot. But that was the last overhaul, so that's kind of what the date we default back to in terms of like our new start date. And so it was very heavy-handed, and our existing non-conforming code doesn't allow for repairs. It doesn't allow for what they term non-structural repairs, so a roof repair. It's essentially hoping that a property becomes dilapidated, unsafe, has to be torn down, and then we can transition the use. It's strict with our minimum lot sizes. It doesn't permit anything less than 3,500 square feet. We do have a few of those around town that we've had to take through a variance process. It assumed that when those properties would become dilapidated, that they would get torn down and that their neighbors would purchase them, have a bigger lot, conform to zoning in that regard. That really hasn't happened, and that shift in mentality for what we want to see has dramatically changed since the 80s. If we have two small lots, we don't necessarily want that neighbor, and if that happens, it's fine, because people do want larger yards. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing or not, but as a city, from the property tax perspective, from the housing unit perspective, we'd rather see that lot built on again. If it's big enough to have a sizable and marketable unit, we'd rather see a unit there. So that's just a shift in mentality from the 80s than we have today. The current code also include an amortization schedule to discontinue uses based on like building type. There have been a series of lawsuits nationally between the 80s and now that essentially say if you amortize out a property, it's considered a property taking, and the city must financially compensate them for that. We have never, to my knowledge, utilized that part of our code. We'll be recommending to get rid of it. We also don't have the financial means to do that. So if we're not going to, don't have it in code is kind of my philosophy. So with the proposed code changes that we'll step through here in a minute, we'd recommend that non-conforming uses be allowed to make repairs to keep them safe and orderly, but to transition them out and limit them through expansions. Couldn't do additions, couldn't do any type that would make the use more intense on the property. And what that does is it takes a more market stance to transitioning a use out of a district than a dilapidated, unsafe slum and blight. So in that case, if somebody outgrows their non-conforming business or whatever, okay, now it's time for you to find a new property that does meet your needs in an allowable district. What's there today can stay, you can't make it bigger. The non-conforming lots, we'd be proposing that those smaller lots, if they were legally platted prior to the 80s, and that date comes from the existing code that was established, if they were legally platted, they would be recognized regardless of their size to be sold as a lot. We've run into a series, and this board hasn't seen them, but we've run quite a few through Board of Adjustments in terms of this one, because we've had some small lots. Old days, it used to be like the back half of lot 20, which is a 25 by 140 lot, right? The back half got parceled off, who knows when. It's a legal lot that we established, but it's now like 2,000 square feet versus the zoning district 7,500 square feet. We would say, okay, it has a house on it today, or has a structure, it's legally platted. Let's all just recognize that this exists and not make it go through an administrative process to recognize it. We've had some homeowners be very upset when they get caught in this process. It can jeopardize a sale. A 4 to 6 week admin process can certainly, for our most affordable homes, we're talking small lots, we're talking small houses, for our most affordable, timing can be key. So we do think that the non-conforming lot one is a good one to tackle. The non-conforming structure piece, again, this would be the uses allowed, the setbacks just probably aren't being met, or the impervious surface. This is one where we have a question for you folks that if it's an allowable use, but the structure is non-conforming, should it be allowed to be rebuilt? A lot of the non-conforming comes to like financing and insurance pieces of it, which they want to guarantee that should something happen, can I have what I have today? Can I insure it? Can I get value out of it if something were to happen? The HB 1500 is where the state is saying if you're residential, you have to no matter what, if that passes. Here, we're saying and suggesting, thinking of your Dyke Avenue light industrial properties, your commercial properties, your North Fifth commercial, North Washington, some commercial properties there. Those uses are allowed, they're in their right zoning district, but maybe they're too close to the road. Maybe they don't have as big of a rear yard as they should, our current code says they should. But if they were to, something were to happen, be damaged more than 50%, would we all be okay if they rebuilt in their existing footprint? Staff is taking the perspective and proposing that yes, we would. Has to meet certain guidelines, which are kind of outlined on this next one, that it can't be bigger, can't be taller, can't encroach over a lot line, has to meet health and safety codes, has to, can't make parking any worse for any reason or whatever that might be. But so if it meets all those check marks, could they just rebuild without any type of approval political process? Staff saying regardless of use, if you're an allowable use in your district, if you don't quite meet your front yard setback, if you don't quite do this, we think it would be fair and fine to open it up. They exist today. The reality is, would everybody build to their exact footprint? Maybe, maybe not. But if your if your lending and your insurance says, yes, you can have this back and you want to reopen and reestablish, it's an easier process to let it go. That's not the same for use. If you're not an allowable use in the district, we would not allow you to expand. And if you're commercial or industrial, we would say, okay, nope, you had something happen. We need this to transition. We're going to transition you out, unless you're residential, kind of aligning with that state law. So it's very much different than if you're a non-conforming use versus your non-conforming structure. Use is kind of what we're focusing on in terms of making sure that our districts transition to where they ought to be and maybe stepping back a little less on the aesthetic setbacks side of things. So I'll run through quick the code, and it's a beastie. Where did I save that? So what I did with the code, and you see there's a bunch of marked up and crossed out options there. But what I tried to do, because the existing code is so convoluted and backtracks in on itself, I tried to just highlight through comments where things were reestablished in the new code, what we're recommending removal of, what we need to follow up with the city attorney on. So there's a lot of red marks, but it was more so meant to be like, okay, we didn't totally, we reworded it and made it clearer, but we didn't abandon this idea, this carried through, is what I had hoped to do with the comments on the side for you there. So the big ones, I guess, for some of the follow-ups with the city attorney is the effective date of this chapter. Typically, it's always the date that the ordinance is approved unless it's specified. This one backtracks in on itself a couple different times that it's really confusing. However, the word effective date is utilized throughout the code, so I want to make sure if we remove something, we don't have some negative spillover effect. So just a little one there, but the other big one that we have to follow up with the city attorney on is the second none, which essentially says that if you have two properties under the same ownership adjacent to each other, if joining them would make them more consistent with the zoning code, we as a city will count them as one property. I don't know, and my question to the city attorney is that if they're two separate lots, two legal lots that have been platted with the county recorders, how could we ever stop a sale? How could we ever stop a homeowner or a property owner, from selling off a parcel? Without a land use restricted agreement on the property, which we don't have the staff capacity to evaluate every single property in town and determine that, and file that against a property, unless you have something at the county recorders that would flag against a title review or something like that, I don't know how we could ever possibly enforce this section of code. And so I think, I don't even know how you could claw that back. If somebody did sell a lot that was supposed to be joined as one for zoning purposes, I don't know how you could ever really undo that. And very convoluted process through court is my assumption. But at that point, is it worth it? Anything that would be worth it, it probably has a building across the lot line that the owner is selling altogether anyway, because they'd be jeopardizing their own building. So it's kind of a market correction piece of it, and I just don't think it's enforceable. I get the intent that back in the day when they were 25-foot lots and Bob bought 3, like he considers it as one, but still they're legal lots. They could be sold and have a house on them, or maybe they want to be split up now and put a house on individually. So I just don't know how much we can enforce it, and so that one's a big one. We have the city attorney waiting for feedback on. The rest of some of the other stuff, again, we want to encourage repairs. We want to keep buildings safe. We just want to transition the use out. Some of these other sections, the way the current code was written was just very convoluted in terms of if this scenario, then this, but a very similar, almost exact scenario with one change different than that. And so we're trying to clean that up a little bit and reestablishing those structures just to make it very clear cut. Because when you're in this section of code, you're telling somebody they can't do something with their property. And so it has to be very clear and very definitive to be able to explain the transition and the intent. And when things get back and forth and you can't agree on the interpretation, it gets very confusing. So, and very frustrating. This would be the amortization part that we're suggesting gets removed. We don't want to monetarily buy out anybody. Again, the structural repairs is continuing. And again, the repairs issue, and where some of the stuff carried through. So the new code is laid out ideally in a way that's very straightforward in terms of this is what a non-conforming use is, structure, lot. The policy intent, zoning district change, we want to make this conform with the new uses. It also does a little bit better job of spelling out when things can and can't happen, the determination of the status, repairs and maintenance that they are allowed, transition of tenancy and ownership. If it's a non-conforming retail operation and it changes, but it's still a retail operation, that use is still the same. Owner may be different, may have changed the name a little bit, but that use is still the same. That can continue on. And then we added a floodplain compliance piece of it just to make sure we maintain our certifications needed for all of that. And then we get into the specific different types. So the non-conforming use, this is where we would be saying that you cannot enlarge it if you're a non-conforming use. You can relocate it to a district where it would be allowed. If you discontinue or stop, cease operations for 18 months, you go vacant, you don't have a tenant, whatever. After 18 months, we say, okay, that grandfathered non-conforming clause is done. You now need to abide by the new uses. You couldn't continue in an existing non-conforming use at that point. And this is also where we have that damage and destruction piece, where, you know, if you're commercial, industrial, if you're damaged more than 50%, you'd have to abide by zoning code and meet it. You could reconstruct it, but you'd have to meet current standards to do so.
Andrew, do you want to enlarge the text on our screens? That would be hard.
You tell me that after I'm like 6 pages in. Okay, sorry. My bad. I was going. So in the use section, this is where we're adding that if you're residential, you would be allowed to rebuild regardless if you're non-conforming use or not. You guys gotta speak up quicker than that, because now I feel kind of dumb, but, and again, you'd have to abide by those things. You can't be bigger, can't be larger, wider, can't make parking worse, must meet fire and life safety codes, those different things. No, that doesn't work. And then the change in use, if you want to change it, you have to abide or be less intense, and not accessories can't continue. We get into non-conforming lots. Again, this date is a holdover from the existing code. I don't know why it was chosen. We decided not to rock the boat and pick a different one. We're just going to go with what was there previous to the code. But this says if you have a lot or a structure, you can continue it on a small lot. You just can't expand it without being able to abide by code. Again, this lot merger piece, we're not sure if it's going to stay or not. That's the whole, if it's two, it has to be one for zoning purposes to make it conform. I just don't know if it's enforceable. The structures piece of it, again, this would be, can't expand or make it worse. But if you're damaged more than 50%, again, that insurance and financing piece, this is where we're suggesting that any use, if it's an allowable use, we accept that the setbacks could be rebuilt as is. Could be relocated. We did not touch the non-conforming mobile home parks, the junkyards. We didn't look at those at this point in time. what we took on right now is kind of enough at this point. Ultimate goal is to go back and make sure those are up to speed and see if anything needs updating with them. And I'm sure we'll touch signs whenever we get to that portion too. The only thing we did add at the very end is an appeals section. Right now, these non-conforming statuses and decisions are made at a staff level. And as a policy, we've brought appeals and maybe variances to make things work through the Board of Adjustments and more policy to this board. But it's not very clear cut and written in. And again, if you're in this code, you're telling somebody what they can and can't do and maybe have to stop operating. So we thought it very prudent to have an appeals section that very clearly lays out that if you disagree with a staff decision, you have an appeal process through planning and zoning and city council. Much like we do for many of the other land development code things we have, it's just very clear and spelled out. Here, if you don't agree, here's what you can do. So I'll take a stop there and just ask if there's any questions. We have some follow-ups to some other stuff.
So to sum it up, help me out with, I assume the red pepper is non-conforming? Business in a residential?
Yep.
So what happens to the red pepper under this? That's what I'm concerned about.
It's a great example because it's a beloved treasure. So in that regard, if it were to, it can't get any bigger. They can't enlarge the restaurant portion of anything like that. It's in a residential district, right? They could do residential expansions or something like that. I don't even know if the lot's big enough to do that, but the business piece of it couldn't expand. If it were to be damaged with this code change, if it were to be damaged more than 50%, no, it would not be permitted to be rebuilt because that use would not be permitted in that district. That would be a zoning change that we could talk about. We've talked about the University Avenue corridor.
That was one of the reasons we talked about micro PUDs way back when is if something like the red pepper wanted to expand, potentially we could look at something. I think they own a vacant lot next to them. Once upon a time, that was a house. It was hit by a car.
Yeah.
It was taken down. I did have a conversation with I believe I had a conversation with the owners at that time that maybe, because I think they were contemplating whether to sell it or not, but it was I wouldn't say that it was always off the table, so maybe there could be an expansion. So I believe they held on to the lot. So just so you guys are aware that if they were in a situation, part of the uniqueness of the pepper is also the way it is today. So if they had would they really completely redo a new pepper? I don't know, but it's a very unique house the way it's set up now. So
Well, I just don't know how many, I use that as an example, sort of tongue in cheek, because it is important to me, but also, I don't know how many non-conforming businesses there are, around, and I would guess that there's probably more than I realize. And so it makes me a little concerned, I just want to understand the impact of what we're going to do.
Yep, and I think in that regard, what we're doing today doesn't change their expansion ability or anything like that, right? Like,
I'm more worried about like, if the building burns down, if the building's destroyed, can they rebuild in a place where everybody knows where they are, the neighbors know that they're there, that sort of thing.
So, and what Ryan's mentioning off the mic there is that we did review, you guys asked us to look at the single-family residential non-conforming piece. It's really hard to track the business. We don't have like a business licensing requirement, so it's really hard to know just what businesses exist out there until we get a phone call. And so part of our site plan approval process is looking at what do you want to do? Are you an allowable use? What do you have today? How do you fit? And we kind of catch it in terms of at that time for businesses mostly.
Because I would assume the businesses have insurance. The business insurance person has already looked into this, and they've already gotten the approval to be able to be insured. And I would hate to make it so that all of a sudden they're not insurable.
I think in those instances, we have so few and far between buried into residential. I think red pepper is a good example because it's in, like the rest of them just kind of like, I don't even know if they exist, but most of our commercial is along our corridors, right? We
Right,
don't
yeah.
really have, M&H convenience store has a conditional use permit to exist and have all those things. Red,
I don't think anything we're doing is making it worse. The proposed uses here, I mean.
Okay, that's,
and I think if something happened, I think it would be a discussion with that property owner of, let's bring forward a rezoning, whether we do a PUD amendment to allow them, or we establish a new conditional use permit for neighborhood restaurants or something like that, I don't know. Like, I think we would have options and work with them to try to figure that out. It certainly is a little bit better on the front end to kind of have that planned out in
Right,
terms
that's what I'm-
of a zoning district. If you're okay with a red pepper, you know, should somebody else be allowed to do a red pepper next to the red pepper or down the street from the red pepper is kind of that equity piece that comes into play, right? Like, we don't want to just focus on them and say only you, right? Like, that shouldn't be how it's looked at. But, so, I mean, there's different things we would do in that regard. And from a planning and admin staff, we have always been like, okay, we'll figure this out. Let's either go through Board of Adjustments to grant you a variance to get you going. Let's take the North Fifth Street process through a rezoning to get you to conform, so you get your sale. So I think that attitude of like, let's figure it out is there. This would just be taking it, if we're always just approving these when they come through, let's just change code. So when we get a phone call, we can say, yep, we've got you covered in code. You don't have to do anything. Just send this to your financer, your insurer, whatever, and just let them know that this exists and you fall under this. So it's more easier in that regard than telling them, yeah, you're a special case. Here's the political process we can take you through and hope it goes through. Is kind of how that conversation between us and the client goes, or the applicant goes. So this would only make things easier for them in that regard. But always that's on the table of, does this make sense to continue on or do it? And then let's bring forward an idea. So.
and I just want to say, I mean, this is a Herculean effort. You did a great job. I mean, this is a lot of work. I have no doubt about it, and thank you for doing that. I
If you
appreciate it.
notice any errors through it, please let me know.
One thing I'll say on the appeals section, I did notice that before, and I was reminded when you went through it again. I don't think it's clear that the first appeal is to the planning and zoning.
Okay?
It talks about you can appeal, and then at the end, I don't think it actually,
Yep, so we'd have to notify within 400 feet that an appeal is taking place. The commission would consider it. You'd consider the policy, which essentially says that why nonconformings exist.
and then you can appeal to the city council.
Yep.
I just think it might be clear if you put it up in that first sentence that the appeal is to the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Got it. Okay. Yep, we'll make that change. Yep, I see what you're talking about here. Yep.
All right?
Anyone else have any questions, comments, concerns? We talked about starting a subcommittee on this to review it.
So that's where we get into the residential piece. Last time when we
Yeah.
talked about that North Fifth Street, you guys asked us to identify how many of these single families exist so we could notify them if we're gonna go through this rezoning process. So our staff evaluated those, and primarily they're around the Gateway Drive, North Washington and South Washington, a little bit of Demers corridor. So our properties that were essentially established before zoning was in effect in Grand Forks. So there's 43 of them. Some of them front Demers, like these three in particular, like front Demers Avenue, right? So from a philosophical concept level, you can see where we wanted the commercial corridor to be commercial, right? We didn't want a single family home there. However, these probably have been zoned commercial for a very long time, as we earlier established, and we haven't seen that commercial activity. It's stayed residential. And so the question, even at a staff level, I've had conversations with Ryan, like, I get the intent of it being commercial and being a commercial corridor. Market demand is what's kind of pulling that residential piece a bit more forward than commercial right now. And so that's a discussion for the Planning and Zoning Committee, and where maybe it's more appropriate to have a subcommittee to talk in detail specific properties, what makes sense, what doesn't. What staff does not want to do is send a letter to a property owner that's saying, hey, Planning Commission is suggesting you have options here. If really when they come forward, you're like, hold up, that's on the corridor, that's fronting the corridor, maybe not this one. So we want to have those discussions ahead of time before we approach property owners. so that we're not, once you put that out there, you're initiating something with a property owner, you don't want to then take it back, is what we're trying to avoid there. So it's a little bit difficult to kind of get into each exact scenario. We certainly can bring it back next month for the full commission. If we want to go to a subcommittee and do a little bit more detailed work that way, we certainly can. But that's kind of our concern right now. And I can see both sides, so.
Are you asking us to do something?
Asking if you want a subcommittee.
Do we want to do a
Do we
subcommittee?
want a subcommittee? Do we want to look at them? If
Yeah, I
you're-
think we should have a subcommittee. I mean, we're not going to sit down as a board and go through all these, but I think someone should.
I do, yeah. that's
Some of them
kinda-
certainly make sense. Some of them front back roads that are across from residential and certain things like that. The harder ones are those that are directly on the corridor. And what happens if one of the three only decides to be rezoned and the other ones don't, and some of those different things, so.
So let's do it. We're looking for 3. If you haven't been on one yet, that's a good time to jump on one. We got the new guy willing to go. I like that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Who else we got? Megan?
I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll do it, Steve.
Okay,
Yes.
2.
That's 3. You got
Oh,
No.
Mr. Buck, I know, he's on so many. I was trying to give him a break.
I'm on the sign committee, and I think that's, we
That
should let
speaks for
somebody else.
itself.
Yes, thank you.
We understand.
Well, for now, we'll go with Mr. Reichert
Okay.
and Mr. Budke and Mr. Holt.
Sounds good. I would like for a little
Thank
bit
you for being
direction in terms
railroaded,
of
Gentlemen.
the actual code change. If we want to bring the code change, kind of what I presented earlier in that Word document, if you're okay with that coming forward preliminary, assuming we get our answers from the city attorney approved. Or if you want to hold that to have this other discussion, what are you willing to kind of move forward with?
I think we should hold it until we do it all at once.
Yeah, I'd like to see it come out of the subcommittee and be ready, because we trust what you guys are going to do.
Sounds good?
Then it's a
Yep.
brief look
That-
and vote.
Just to back, there's, that, we can do that all at the same time, that makes sense.
Thanks for listening to that presentation.
Good job.
Thank you, Stephanie. I mean, Andrea. You started it. All right. Any other business?
Move to adjourn.
Any seconds? Mr. Budke? So moved. We're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.